Charleston's harbor was slick with rain that evening, the kind that blurred the gas lanterns into soft halos along King Street and turned the cobblestones into a mirror for the city's muted lights. The harbor house sat at the end of the row, an old brick building with tall arched windows looking out toward the restless water. Inside, the air was warm and scented with butter, lemon, and the faint brine of the day's catch. A pianist in the corner played slow, wistful jazz, his fingers moving lazily over ivory keys while the occasional clink of silverware punctuated the quiet. Every table was a small island of polished wood, linen napkins folded like origami, wine glasses lined up with military precision. Daniel Harper sat alone at a window table, his view split between the rippling harbor and the plate in front of him. The seafood platter, lobster tail split open, scallops gleaming under a glaze of garlic butter, sat untouched, steam rising in slow ribbons. He had chosen this restaurant because Laura had loved it, because they had once sat at this very table on their 10th anniversary. That was before the accident, before the sirens, before the military funeral that left him holding a folded flag instead of his wife and their 7-year-old son. 10 years had passed, yet grief clung to him like the damp coastal air, seeping into his bones no matter how many layers of time he tried to wear over it. He swirled the amber in his glass of bourbon, watching how the liquid caught the lamplight. Outside, rain tapped against the window in a steady rhythm, the harbor wind pressing in from the dark. The room's low hum of conversation didn't touch him. It was a muffled world, as if he were underwater, hearing life from a distance. He raised the glass halfway, hesitating, not from indecision but because the act of drinking had become a habit without comfort. That was when a voice cut through. Soft, trembling, unexpected. "Sir, may I have your leftovers?" It was barely more than a whisper, yet it seemed to slice the air between piano notes. Daniel turned his head and found himself looking at a young woman who could not have been more than 21. Her hair was damp from the rain, a tangle of chestnut waves pulled loosely into a knot, strands clinging to her cheeks. Her coat was worn to the threads, the cuffs frayed, its thin fabric darkened by the evening drizzle. In her arms, a baby swaddled in a faded blue blanket rested against her chest, his round cheeks flushed with the warmth of her body. The child's wide eyes, a startling shade of gray, were fixed on the plate before Daniel as though the steam itself was calling him. The request seemed to drain the room of sound. Forks paused midair. A couple at the next table exchanged a glance. A waiter started forward, but Daniel lifted a hand, a small gesture that halted him in place. He studied the young woman's face, no makeup, no artifice, and not a flicker of shame. There was exhaustion, yes, and a kind of guarded stillness, but also something else beneath it. It wasn't desperation for herself, it was the fierce, unbending focus of someone who had learned to endure for the sake of another. The candle between them flickered as he shifted, nudging the plate toward her without a word. She didn't snatch it. Instead, she set the baby carefully into the crook of one arm and pulled a neatly folded piece of wax paper from the worn satchel slung across her shoulder. With deliberate care, she wrapped the food as though it were something fragile, folding each corner tightly before tucking it away. Then she drew out a small plastic spoon, dipping it into the potatoes, blowing on the bite and offering it to the baby. Daniel watched as the child accepted the spoonful with a soft coo, his tiny fingers curling against her coat. The moment the food touched his tongue, his expression shifted into pure contentment, a smile so unguarded it seemed to light the space between them. Daniel's chest tightened unexpectedly, the air in his lungs caught somewhere between memory and the present. He hadn't seen a smile like that since Michael years ago before the crash. Around them, the restaurant remained silent, the wealthy patrons pretending not to watch, but Daniel could feel their stares like a pressure against his back. The young woman didn't notice or didn't care. She kept feeding the boy slowly, her movements steady, her gaze fixed entirely on him. It was an act so ordinary, so stripped of performance, that it felt almost sacred. When the child's small belly was full, she wiped his mouth with the edge of the blanket and held him close, rocking him gently. She glanced up at Daniel then, not in thanks, not in pity, but in acknowledgement, as if to say they had shared something that didn't require words. And then she turned, making her way toward the door. Daniel sat motionless for a beat, staring at the space she'd just occupied. The candle's flames swayed, casting brief shadows across his glass, his untouched fork, the linen napkin folded neatly at his side. Before he could overthink it, he stood, leaving a few bills beneath the edge of his plate. Without hurry, he followed her through the door into the rain-soaked night, keeping just enough distance that she wouldn't notice the sound of his footsteps against the wet cobblestones. Somewhere ahead, the glint of her damp hair caught the streetlight, leading him deeper into the narrow streets beyond King Street, away from the warm glow of the harbor house and into the quiet shadows where the city's heartbeats slowed. The rain had eased to a mist by the time Daniel trailed her down a narrow side street lined with shuttered storefronts and rusting fire escapes. The pavement glistened under the weak glow of street lamps, each light haloed in the damp air. She walked with her head slightly bowed, one arm wrapped firmly around the baby, the other clutching the strap of the satchel. Her pace was brisk but not hurried, measured steps that suggested she was used to moving in the shadows without drawing attention. They crossed into a part of the city where the polished charm of Charleston gave way to something more neglected. The cobblestones grew uneven, weeds sprouting between the cracks, and the air took on the faint metallic scent of the river. She passed an old brick warehouse with boarded windows, then cut across a gravel lot where puddles mirrored the dim light above. At the far edge, Daniel saw it. A navy blue sedan, the kind that had been solid in its day but now sat slouched on its tires, the paint flaking in wide patches. The rear window was fogged from the inside, and a strip of duct tape sealed a crack along the passenger door. She didn't hesitate. Opening the back door, she slipped inside with the child, closing it softly behind her. Through the windshield, Daniel caught a glimpse of movement, her shifting to settle the baby against a blanket laid across the back seat. A stuffed rabbit with one ear missing was propped in the corner, and a small cardboard box served as a makeshift shelf for formula cans, a half-empty water bottle, and a few jars of baby food. It was not a place meant for living, but it had the unmistakable signs of home. Daniel stood in the shadows for a long minute, the damp seeping into his collar. He wasn't sure what he had expected to find, but the sight struck him harder than he anticipated. He turned and walked back the way he came, his mind already running through possibilities. A motel would be warmer. A shelter might be safer. But he knew enough about pride, about the fragile thread people walk when they've had to fight for every scrap of dignity, to understand that barging in with offers would only drive her further away. The next morning, before dawn, he returned. The car was still there, parked in the same spot. He approached quietly and set a small brown paper bag against the rear wheel on the driver's side. Inside, he had placed a thermos of hot coffee, a container of scrambled eggs and toast from a 24-hour diner, and a soft fleece blanket still wrapped in store plastic. There was no note, no signature. Then he walked away, blending into the slow awakening of the city. Over the next week, the deliveries continued. Sometimes it was a pack of diapers tucked inside a grocery sack, other times a bag of fresh fruit or a small jar of baby lotion. Once, he left a children's board book about animals, its corners rounded from use but still clean. He never lingered to see her reaction. Yet each morning the items were gone, and the car remained in its place. It was during this quiet ritual that the first crack of doubt slipped in. One evening, back at the harbor house for a meeting with an old acquaintance, Daniel overheard a conversation from a table behind him. A man in a linen blazer leaned close to his companion, speaking low but not low enough. "Saw Harper last week. Heard he's been hanging around that girl who works the street scams, uses a baby to get sympathy." The other man chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "It's Charleston. Every hustler's got a story." Daniel didn't turn around. He kept his expression still, but the words stuck like grit under his skin. He thought of the way she had fed the baby with careful, steady hands, the way she had wrapped the food as if it were treasure. Could it have been calculated? The notion scraped against his instincts, but once planted, it was impossible to ignore. That night, he drove by the gravel lot again, parking far enough away that his headlights wouldn't reach the sedan. The car was dark except for a faint glow from a battery-powered lantern inside. Through the glass, he saw her seated cross-legged in the back, the baby asleep on her lap. She was mending something, a tiny knit cap, the needle and thread catching bits of lantern light. There was no audience, no performance, only the quiet rhythm of her work. The rumor still lingered in his mind, but watching her like that, Daniel felt the scales tip. He had learned in the Navy that sometimes you have to trust what you've seen with your own eyes over what you've heard. He eased the truck into reverse, leaving before she could notice. The following morning he left another package, a sealed container of homemade stew still warm from his kitchen, and a new bottle for the baby. He tucked it in the same spot by the rear wheel, the habit now almost a kind of unspoken agreement. She would never see him leave it. He would never see her take it. Yet between those small acts something had begun to grow, fragile, unspoken and far from trust, but no longer complete suspicion either. The first cold snap of November swept through Charleston like a sudden shiver, bringing with it a damp chill that clung to everything. By late afternoon, the air along the harbor carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Daniel had driven past the old sedan earlier that day, noticing the windows rolled up tight and a faint haze of condensation inside. He didn't stop. The last thing he wanted was to intrude. But something about the stillness of the car stuck with him all evening, gnawing at the edges of his concentration. Grace felt it before she could name it. Eli had been fussier than usual all morning, his little hands hot against her collarbone, his appetite fading. By sunset, his forehead burned under her touch. She had tried every home remedy she knew, cool cloths pressed to his skin, rocking him gently, whispering to calm his restless cries, but nothing seemed to help. As darkness settled over the city, his breathing turned fast and shallow, the sound of it clawing at her chest. By the time she reached the nearest emergency room, her arms ached from holding him so tightly. The waiting area was bright in that harsh way only hospitals managed, its smell a sterile mix of disinfectant and recycled air. Behind the counter, a nurse glanced up briefly when Grace explained her son had a fever. Her expression didn't change until Grace admitted she had no insurance. The nurse's tone cooled. "We're at capacity tonight. You'll have to wait. Or try East Cooper, maybe they have room." Grace's voice caught, the words tumbling out faster than she could think. "Please, he's only 9 months old. He's burning up. I think it's over 104. He's not responding." The nurse looked past her to the next person in line. "Ma'am, you'll have to wait until triage can see you. That's all I can do." Outside, the night air hit her like a wall. She sank down onto a bench just beyond the sliding doors, Eli limp against her chest, his tiny breaths uneven. Panic narrowed the world to the weight in her arms and the sound of his breathing. Her phone felt slippery in her hand as she scrolled to the one number she had never used but had kept since the night in the restaurant. She typed 2 words, "Help us." She didn't know if Daniel would come. She didn't know if she was even right to ask. But 6 minutes later, headlights cut across the curb, and his dark pickup pulled up hard enough for the brakes to whine. He was out of the truck before the engine settled, his coat still half-buttoned, his eyes scanning her face before dropping to the baby in her arms. He didn't waste time with questions. "Let me take him," he said, and his tone left no space for argument. Eli didn't protest. His small hand curled instinctively around Daniel's finger, his head falling against the man's chest. Daniel strode through the ER doors without slowing, his voice like a crack of thunder in the antiseptic air. "I want a doctor now. This child is in critical condition. I'll cover every cent, but if you let 1 more minute pass, I will buy this building and fire every person standing in my way." The room froze, and within seconds, a nurse appeared to lead them through the double doors. Grace followed, her knees weak from relief. In the small exam room, monitors beeped steadily as the medical team worked over Eli, checking vitals, running a quick flu test, placing a tiny oxygen mask over his face. The pediatrician's calm voice eventually broke through the haze. "He's stable now. We'll keep him overnight for observation." Grace sank into the chair beside the bed, her hands covering her face for a long moment. When she finally looked up, Daniel was still there, leaning against the wall, watching Eli with a focus so intent it almost hurt to see. He didn't speak until the nurse left the room. "He's safe now," he said quietly. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. The hours blurred together after that. Grace drifted in and out of shallow sleep, waking to the sound of Daniel pacing softly or adjusting Eli's blanket. At some point in the night, she felt the weight of his coat draped over her shoulders, its warmth seeping in. It was the first time since she had become a mother that she allowed herself to fall apart in front of someone else. Daniel didn't try to fix her tears. He simply stayed steady and present. By morning, Eli's fever had broken, and the color had returned to his cheeks. The relief was so sharp it left Grace lightheaded. But before they could even leave the hospital, a different storm had begun to build. A photo taken by someone in the waiting room had surfaced online. Daniel Harper, well known in Charleston's business circles, carrying a baby in his arms with a young woman close behind. By the time the sun had fully risen, the image had been shared hundreds of times. Local gossip blogs speculated wildly. Was she his secret girlfriend? His mistress? A con artist with a baby as a prop? Strangers on social media dissected every detail of the grainy shot, from Grace's worn sneakers to the way Daniel's hand cupped the back of Eli's head. Some voices called him a hero. Others accused her of manipulation. Grace saw the headlines later that afternoon while sitting beside Eli's crib in the small apartment Daniel had arranged for them after discharge. Each swipe of her phone brought another wave of judgment. Her stomach knotted as she locked the screen and set it face down. Outside the window, the city bustled on, unaware that inside, the quiet was heavy with the knowledge that their lives had just shifted, this time in full view of the world. 3 days after the hospital discharge, the letter arrived without warning. It was tucked under the apartment door, its plain white envelope marked only with Grace's name in handwriting she recognized instantly. She stood in the narrow hallway for a long time before picking it up, her pulse quickening with the weight of something she hadn't expected to see again. Inside, the paper was creased from being folded too many times, as though the sender had held it for days before letting it go. The message was short. No explanations. No apologies. Just a few lines. If there's still a chance to know my grandson, I would like to try. Grace read it twice, then set it on the kitchen counter, as if distance from the words might make them less real. She went through the motions of the day, feeding Eli, wiping the counters, folding laundry, but her thoughts kept circling back to the letter. She had been 20 when her parents told her to leave, their faces rigid with the certainty of people who thought they were protecting a reputation. She hadn't heard from them since, not even when Eli was born. That evening, Daniel arrived with groceries. He noticed the way she hovered near the counter, her eyes drifting toward the envelope as though it were an unwelcome guest. He didn't press right away, but after a few minutes of quiet unpacking he asked, "You've been somewhere else all day. What happened?" Grace slid the letter toward him without meeting his eyes. He read it once, then set it down gently. "What are you thinking?" She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "I don't know. Part of me wants to tear it up. Part of me wonders if Eli should meet them, even if I don't want to." Daniel studied her for a moment. "You don't owe them anything," he said. She hesitated, her voice low. "But maybe he deserves the choice. Maybe I shouldn't decide for him." The next morning she made her decision. They would go. The drive to her hometown in rural Georgia was 4 hours, a stretch of road that seemed to lengthen with every mile. Daniel insisted on coming, not to speak for her, but to be there if she needed him. The sky was overcast, the gray light pressing low over the highway. Eli slept most of the first hour, the hum of the tires lulling him into soft breaths. An hour outside of Charleston, the car shuddered unexpectedly. The steering wheel trembled in Grace's hands, and a grinding noise came from under the hood. She pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, heart sinking. Daniel stepped out, lifting the hood and leaning into a cloud of steam. "Radiator hose?" he muttered. "We'll have to wait for a tow." It was nearly an hour before a mechanic from the next town over arrived, a man with oil-stained hands and the kind of easy drawl that stretched every sentence. The repair was quick but expensive. Grace watched Daniel swipe his card without hesitation, her chest tightening with gratitude she didn't know how to express. Back on the road, the landscape began to change. Pine trees crowded closer, the air taking on the scent of damp earth and smoke from distant chimneys. As they entered the outskirts of her hometown, Grace's grip on the wheel tightened. They passed familiar landmarks, a shuttered diner where she'd worked weekends in high school, the old brick library with its cracked front steps, the gas station where her father used to fill the family truck every Saturday morning. Each one carried a memory, and each memory brought a knot to her throat. When they finally turned onto the gravel drive, Grace slowed to a crawl. The house stood at the far end, white paint faded to cream, the porch sagging slightly at one corner. The swing was still there, creaking in the wind as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had. She cut the engine but didn't move, her hands motionless on the wheel. Daniel didn't speak, he just waited, the quiet between them steady. The front door opened slowly and a woman stepped out. Her hair was more silver than Grace remembered, her posture smaller, though her eyes, so sharp once, were now rimmed with uncertainty. She looked at Grace first, then at the baby in the car seat. Her lips parted, but no words came right away. Finally she took a step forward, her voice catching. "I was scared. I cared too much about what people thought. And I lost you." Grace didn't answer. Her father appeared in the doorway behind her mother, older, his shoulders stooped. He stepped forward until he was level with his wife, his gaze fixed on Eli. The baby stared back with open curiosity, as if sensing none of the history in the air. Grace unbuckled him slowly, lifting him into her arms. When her mother asked, "May I hold him?" Grace hesitated for a long heartbeat before placing Eli gently into her arms. The older woman clutched him as though afraid he might disappear, her tears falling silently onto his blanket. Eli reached up, touching her cheek with a tiny hand, and something unspoken shifted in the space between them. Grace stood still, the wind rustling through the pine trees, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke. She wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but in that moment she could see a path toward it, slow, uneven, but possible. Inside, the kitchen was just as she remembered. Yellow curtains faded by the sun, the same mismatched mugs on the counter, the old clock ticking steadily on the wall. Her father made tea while her mother sat at the table with Eli in her lap, rocking him gently. Conversation came in starts and stops, like a creek finding its way over stones. There were long silences, but they felt less like avoidance and more like space to breathe. When it was time to leave, her mother walked them to the porch. The swing swayed softly behind her, and for the first time in years, Grace stepped forward and embraced her. It was not a full mending, but it was a beginning, something fragile like glass but worth holding on to. Daniel watched from the truck, his hands resting on the steering wheel, knowing this was a road Grace would have to walk in her own way. As they pulled out of the drive, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the weight in her chest felt a little lighter than it had when they arrived. A year slipped by with the quiet persistence of tides, measured not in days but in the small rituals that had taken root in their lives. Morning coffee on the balcony while Eli banged a spoon against his high chair. Afternoons spent walking along the Battery, the child toddling between them, clutching their hands as if the whole harbor belonged to him. Evenings when Daniel read aloud from picture books, his deep voice turning simple words into a kind of anchor. What had begun in the shadows of a rain-soaked street had grown into something steady, almost ordinary in its comfort. The rumors that had once swirled around them had faded, replaced by the mundane details of life. Daniel had sold the big house he rarely entered and bought a smaller place closer to the water. Grace had started a part-time job at the public library, bringing home stacks of children's books for Eli and the faint scent of paper and ink in her hair. They didn't define their relationship in public. They didn't need to. It was stitched together in the unspoken ways they showed up for each other. On an early spring afternoon, Daniel asked her to come down to the marina. The sun hung low, spilling gold across the water, the air warm enough that the smell of salt seemed sharper. His boat, the Second Wind, rocked gently against its moorings. She had been aboard before, but this time he had laid a blanket across the deck, a small cooler beside it, and a vase with 3 white lilies standing tall despite the breeze. Eli, now too and endlessly curious, was already there, wearing a tiny life vest and trying to peer over the edge into the water. They set out slowly, the harbor opening around them in soft blues and silvers. Daniel steered with one hand, glancing at Grace now and then as if committing every detail of her face to memory. When they reached a quiet stretch near the mouth of the river, he cut the engine. The boat rocked gently in the afternoon swell. Grace sat with Eli in her lap, the boy's hair ruffled by the wind. Daniel came to stand in front of them, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, he simply looked at her as if deciding how to start. "The night I first saw you," he began, "I thought it was your courage that stopped me. But it was your eyes. I couldn't place it for months, and then one morning I remembered. My son had the same look when he was hungry and trying to hide it, this mix of stubbornness and hope." His voice caught, but he went on. "I thought I'd never see that again. And then you walked in." Grace held his gaze, the wind lifting strands of her hair across her cheek. He took a slow breath. "I learned the truth too, why you were living in that car. It wasn't just because your parents turned you away. You'd taken out loans for nursing school, but when you got pregnant, you left so you wouldn't be in debt without a degree. You wanted every dollar you made to go to Eli. You didn't tell me because you didn't want pity." She felt heat rise in her face, but she didn't look away. "I didn't want you to think I was someone to rescue," she said quietly. "I just needed a chance to keep him safe." Daniel nodded, then crouched down, pulling something from his pocket. It was a small box, plain and worn at the edges, as though it had been carried for a while. He opened it to reveal a simple ring. No oversized diamond, just a gold band with a narrow inlay of sapphire, the blue catching the sunlight like a shard of sky. "Grace Miller," he said, his voice steady now, "you didn't take my leftovers that night. You gave me back the part of myself I thought was gone for good. You gave me reason to be more than a man going through the motions. Will you marry me?" Before Grace could answer, Eli wriggled free from her lap and toddled over, wrapping both arms around Daniel's leg. He looked up and announced with absolute certainty, "Daddy?" The word hung in the air, simple and whole, as Daniel bent to scoop him up, holding the boy against his chest with one arm and offering the ring to Grace with the other. Her answer came without hesitation. Yes. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't need to be. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger and she leaned into him, Eli wedged between them, the 3 of them balanced on the rocking deck while the river curled around them in slow waves. Later, as the boat drifted back toward the marina, Grace sat with her head against Daniel's shoulder, watching Eli trace circles on the wooden deck with his small fingers. She thought about that first night, the untouched plate of food, the flicker of candlelight, the way she had walked out expecting never to see him again. She thought about all the miles between then and now, the long road home, the quiet mornings, the second chances neither of them had been looking for. In the fading light, Daniel's hand covered hers, the ring warm from her skin. The harbor came into view, lanterns beginning to glow along the docks. Grace realized that what she had asked for that night, just a little warmth, a little safety for her son, had been only the beginning. What they had built since wasn't about charity or rescue. It was about finding each other in the quiet spaces where life offers what's left and discovering that sometimes, the leftovers are the richest part. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.